I'll give it a try. It's possible I say this every year, every 4 years, but boy, are these the worst candidates ever. Maybe it's always true, and maybe they actually do get worse every time, but it sure seems this year that these are terrible candidates that the two major parties are putting up, and it means that there ought to be an opportunity for a sane, accomplished, third party or independent candidate. At the Cato Institute, a colleague walked into my office the other day, well, let's say it's a month ago, and said, "You're going to hate me if I tell you what I'm thinking." I'm surprised to that. What are you thinking? He said, "I'm thinking that if Bloomberg runs, he'll get a lot of the Libertarian vote." And my initial reaction was to flash and say, "Are you?" And then it suddenly hit me. My God, he would against Trump and Hillary, or Trump and Bernie. When I say Libertarian vote, I'll get to what I mean about that later. Not this Libertarian. But Bloomberg's not as terrible as Trump and Hillary. And if I were Bloomberg, I would have run for president, and I would have just had bumper stickers that said, "Bloomberg, he's not insane." It would put him at the top of the pack. But I suspect there will be better candidates, and since he's not going to be one of them, I do think there is room for a third-party candidate. I quoted Mencken earlier. I like to quote Mencken, especially in election years, so I'm going to do it one more time. Mencken made a lot of astute and acerbic commentaries on democracy. One of them was, "As democracy is perfected, the office of president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron." But enough about the current campaign. It's been an interesting few years for libertarianism. Everybody's talking about it. Some of you younger people may not understand that that's not the way it always is. I was a young libertarian in like 1980, and nobody was talking about it. We had to work hard. We used to joke, you know, we're lucky if they think we're librarians and not libertarians. Now, everybody talks about it. If I had a PowerPoint here, if I had a slideshow, I'd show you a lot of headlines in major newspapers about libertarian factions and libertarian voters and so on. And a lot of this, of course, comes out of the work that a lot of people have been doing for many years, and a lot of it comes out of the 2008 Ron Paul campaign, which really caught on in a way that Ron Paul never expected, and neither did anybody else. And people started talking about libertarian voters. And then, after the Ron Paul 2008 campaign ended around March of 2008, and the financial crisis didn't blow up until the fall. And so then you get the crisis and the bailouts and then the stimulus bill and Obamacare, and there's this huge reaction against all of that. And a journalist wrote a couple of years after that, looking back, "The philosophical casualty of the Great Recession was supposed to be libertarianism, but signs to the contrary are thriving. The Obama administration brought with it ambitions of a resurgence of FDR and LBJ's active state liberalism, and with it, Obama has revived the enduring American challenge to the state." Americans don't like big government, despite a lot of what you see. And when you push too far, then there is this backlash. Of course, it's too bad that the regular backlash against big government power grabs never comes until the government has grabbed the power. And then people say, wait a minute, they shouldn't have done that, they shouldn't have bailed out Wall Street, they shouldn't have spent all that money. But at least it helped. In the 1960s, Gallup used to poll on the question of can you trust the government to do what is right most of the time, some of the time, not much of the time. They used to get 70% of Americans to say you can trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. In a poll last year, that number was not 70%, it was 17%. That's what big government has delivered and what opportunity anti-big government candidates have. One poll that major pollsters do occasionally is, on the whole, would you prefer a smaller government with fewer services or a larger government with more services? Kind of a straightforward big government question. And Those numbers go up and down, but recently I noticed they were getting 58% for smaller government, 38% for larger government. Now, if you notice, there's a problem with that question. Smaller government with fewer services. What's the flip side of fewer services? Lower taxes. But they don't say that. They don't say higher taxes go with big government. Well, one pollster, Scott Rasmussen, now the Rasmussen Report, tried asking this question in a more balanced way. Would you prefer a smaller government with fewer services and lower taxes, or, he didn't even say bigger, which would have been a better term, he would say a more active government with more services and higher taxes. When you do that, the number changes from 58-38 to about 66-22. Tell people that the services will cost taxes, and the number of people who want this bigger government, this more services, falls to 22%. So that, I think, is something very important, and I think it's something the pollsters ought to fix. Gallup these days is finding in its polls that 55 to 60% of Americans say the government is trying to do too many things that ought to be left to individuals and businesses. And every year Gallup does an interesting thing. They don't always publish these results. But they ask, once a year, they ask two questions on one of their polls. Number one, some people think the government is trying to do too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses. Others think government should do more to solve our country's problem. Which do you think? And the second question, some people think the government should promote traditional values in our society. Others think the government should not favor any particular set of values. Which is your view? And by taking those two questions, they can divide people into four categories. Libertarians, they keep the government out of both of those areas. What they call populists say the government should be involved in both of those, and liberals and conservatives are for one and not the other. This year, for the first time, the largest quadrant is the libertarians. 27% of the electorate says, no, don't promote traditional values and don't do more things to solve society's problems. So that 27%, that's what I mean when I say the libertarian vote. Up until now, hasn't been the Libertarian Party vote. People with those views don't have a good representative in national politics. That's what I meant when I said Bloomberg could get some of the libertarian vote. Because if you were one of those 27%, you might think, compared to Trump or Hillary, well, practically anybody would be better, but he could have been one. When Obama got elected, well, first when Bush started bailing out Wall Street, and then when Obama got elected, there was all this spending, bailouts, reaction to the spending and the bailouts and the reaction to Obamacare then, and some people called that, after the 2008 election, a turn to the right, the Tea Party, hostility to Obamacare. But at the very same time, as this Tea Party hostility to debt and spending and Obamacare, we saw a lot of progress toward gay marriage and toward marijuana legalization. Not enough progress on the latter, but some. So it wasn't exactly a turn to the right. It was more a turn in a libertarian direction. And then, as those things were happening, we had, in the first years of the Obama administration, a libertarian lollapalooza of scandals. And you can expect this when the government gets involved in everything. You're going to get a lot of scandals. So what did we have? We had the IRS targeting Tea Party groups. We had the cover-up and lies about what happened in Benghazi. We had the government scooping up the telephone records of AP reporters, spying on both the phone calls and emails of a Fox News reporter. And then, of course, Edward Snowden's revelations about how much the government was spying on all of us. And all of these things. The nice thing about the NSA scandal was it swept all the other scandals off the front page. So from Obama's point of view, at least he only had to deal with one scandal after that. But these scandals and revelations pushed a lot of people in the libertarian direction. They revived memories of Rand Paul's filibuster over drone attacks that had happened a few months earlier. They got members of the U.S. Senate actually asking some questions about what the government is doing in regard to surveillance, wiretapping, and so on. These revelations, these scandals, actually it wasn't the NSA revelations, all of these scandals, Benghazi, IRS, and so on, were so shocking that Michael Gerson, who used to write speeches for President Bush, and who is the most vociferously anti-libertarian newspaper columnist in America, wrote a column one day titled "Making Libertarians of Us All." You have got to abuse power something bad to make Michael Gerson start thinking he might be a libertarian. And interestingly enough, the libertarian sentiment that I see out there is not confined just to the United States. Journalists ask me a lot of times, is the libertarian movement growing? And one of the things I tell them is, 8 years ago there was no national libertarian student group. Now there are 2. And at least one of them, Students for Liberty, is expanding all over the world. They have Students for Liberty Africa, Students for Liberty Haiti, Students for Liberty in Asian countries, Students for Liberty in Europe and Latin America. And recently I saw 2 polls. In Great Britain, a poll of young people found, as the newspaper there said, they were not just the most libertarian generation recently, they were the most libertarian generation in British history. And there was also a poll of the protesters in Turkey that claimed 81% of them told the pollsters that they were libertarian. Now, who knows what the word libertarian means in Turkish? Anyway, all of this is politics. That's all the politics I'm going to talk about unless we have questions. What's important to me is to develop and promote the principles of liberty and limited government. So I think before we get into politics, or before we get into policy analysis or anything else, we first want to decide what it is we stand for. And there's a wonderful phrase from Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, that I like. The obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Natural liberty is what happens when you let people make their own decisions and you follow a few simple rules. Kindergarten rules. Don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, and keep your promises. If those are all the rules you have the simple system of natural liberty. And what happens when you have those rules? Economic growth happens. Social harmony happens. If you have them on both sides of a border, international peace happens. Deirdre McCloskey, who has a new book out this week, says what has happened is a 30-fold increase in living standards in about 250 years in the Western world. Not 30% better, 30 times as good. Now, I think it's very hard to make calculations like that. How do you know you're living 30 times better than somebody in 1750? But to the extent economists can measure, she says it's actually 30 to 100 times, so that's a pretty wide range. At any rate, that's the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. But I would also say, put some meat on the bones of that idea, and that is, no one has the right to initiate aggression against the person or property of anyone else who has not himself initiated the use of force. And this may not be as much of a challenge here, but in Washington, among the people who are pushing for libertarian or free market reform, it's important to keep reminding them that it's not just about utilitarianism, it's not just about better outcomes. Yes, we get economic growth, we get more bathtubs, as they say, more smartphones and so on, if we do these things. But it is about liberty. It is about freedom and limited government. A few years ago, many of you may have seen Robert Novak with his presence on cable television for a long time journalist in Washington. And I got to go to a lunch where he talked about his autobiography that he published shortly before he died. And I remember one of the things he said there was that when he gives commencement addresses, which he noted he didn't give nearly as often as liberal journalists do, but he did give a few, he said one of the things that he told the kids was, always love your country but never trust your government. That's a good rule of thumb, too. It's not entirely clear that that would be a good thing for a political candidate to say, because a lot of people have trouble making that distinction. But I think for us, it's important to remember the difference, and it's valuable for distinguished journalists to tell college students to think about that. That is a lesson we have to continually relearn. A couple of years ago, on the 4th of July, the most important newspaper in America, the New York Times, how do you celebrate the 4th of July? Well, most Americans fly flags, and they have parades, and they read the Declaration of Independence. The New York Times finds all of that jaded and old-fashioned, so they ran an op-ed by a distinguished American writer who complained at length that there is too much freedom in modern America. He wrote, "For hippies and bohemians, as for business people and investors, extreme individualism has been triumphant. What the left and right respectively love and hate are mostly flip sides of the same libertarian coin, minted around 1967. Thanks to the 60s, we are all shamelessly selfish." He calls it selfish. We call it self-reliance, minding your own business, staying out of unnecessary wars, and raising everyone's standard of living by pursuing your own profit. I would also point out these ideas were not developed around 1967. They were maybe developed around 1776, or maybe around 1660 by the levelers, and to some extent they also go back to Jesus' reminder that there are things that are the states, Caesar's, and there are things that are not the states. And that is the fundamental distinction. It goes back to the ancient Israeli tradition of the higher law, and even government is bound by. So to suggest that individualism and liberty were created in the 1960s is just historically ignorant. My good friend Brian Doherty, a few years ago, wrote a history of the American libertarian movement called Radicals for Capitalism. It's a wonderful book, very comprehensive, tells about a lot of aspects of the growth of the Libertarian Party, of the libertarian movement. And in it, he advances two ideas that might seem in conflict. First, libertarian ideas are radical. They go to the root of the question of the man and the state. That's what radical means, going to the root, a fundamental challenge to different ideas. But second, they are deeply rooted in Western civilization, which now, he said, runs on approximately libertarian principles. I think libertarians often have trouble seeing that that's the case. But if you think back to the world 250 years ago, what do we have now? We have generally private property and market relations and a limited government, limited at some level, in the Western world and increasingly other parts of the world. We have freedom of religion. We have science and reason understood to be the important ways of advancing. We have people treated mostly as individuals who have equality rather than knowing your place because if your father was a serf, you are a servant. If your father was king, you are king. And that's a society of hierarchy and status, not a society of competition and merit. In the change that's happened over those 250 years, libertarians have a record to be proud of. We have been fighting ignorance, superstition, privilege, and power for all of those centuries. Brian's book got reviewed in the New York Times, which is always a great thing for an author. The review was fairly critical. He said, for one thing, he devoted too much space to figures like Hayek and Ayn Rand and Friedman. I'm not sure who they thought he should. And they also said libertarians talk about freedom, but they don't necessarily give freedom to other people. For instance, Milton Friedman went to Chile and told the military dictator how to improve his economy. Do they seriously think an economist should not tell any government leader how to make his people less poor? But that was the criticism. The other one was, in this 700-page history of a 70-year-old movement, one of the people who had been mentioned was an anti-Semite. Now, as it happens, what was mentioned about this person was that a leading libertarian of the time, Leonard Read, told people, stay away from that guy, he's an anti-Semite. That's the only way the New York Times knew that there had ever been an anti-Semite close. But I will tell you, If that is the sum total of embarrassing libertarian moments over the past 70 years, it's a pretty darn good record. Modern liberals have to deal with the fact, which is not embarrassing but shameful, that their forebears and ancestors were either supporters or fellow travelers of Stalin and Stalinism and his conspiracy to destroy civilization. That's shameful. And as for conservatives, I could mention their long resistance to equal freedom and equal dignity and equal rights for black people and women and gay people and other groups, but I'll skip over all of that and just say George W. Bush and the Iraq War. In 70 years of libertarian history, there has never been anything as embarrassing as the idea of expressing support for limited constitutional government while also supporting George W. Bush, his disastrous war, and his accumulation of presidential power. That is a record to be proud of and to build on. And sometimes the task of advancing freedom seems overwhelming. But I want to tell you a story about a group of people who faced a far more overwhelming challenge than we did. Not the American founders, whom I mentioned earlier, but another group of people. This story starts about 40 years ago. Around 1978, the United States wanted to put nuclear weapons in Europe to, in theory, protect Europe from the Soviet Union. A lot of people didn't want nuclear weapons in Europe. Western Europeans didn't. Eastern Europeans didn't. The East German government decided it would be good to encourage demonstrations against U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. So they encouraged people to march against the American nuclear weapons. But as it turned out, in a country with very few opportunities for political expression, this sort of created a peace movement based in the remaining Protestant churches that they had not entirely been able to shut down. And the people who had come out to protest nuclear weapons from the United States began to gather in these churches and to pray for peace and to oppose mandatory military service and military classes in grade school, which had not been the plan of the East German government. So the government had to start watching these activists and persecuting them. But the church remained a safe haven. The government would not go into the church and grab people and arrest them. And so these prayers for peace developed. And one particular church in Leipzig, the second largest city, Nikolai Kirche, or St. Nicholas Church, I visited that church a few years later. But that was a place where every Monday evening they started having prayers for peace, in the church where Martin Luther once preached against corruption and power. And under constant pressure in the late 70s and early 80s, attendance at these peace prayers fell to about 10 people in the mid-1980s. But it was the only place in East Germany that you could dissent at all. And so the numbers started to grow again. And then Soviet Premier Gorbachev's reforms gave them some hope. He seemed to be suggesting that it was okay to talk about the problem with a socialist regime. So by 1989, the agents of the East German Secret Service were monitoring 200 groups that it feared were being anti-government by praying for peace. Also, and Germany was unique in this regard, the regime never managed to block West German TV broadcasts, which were, after all, being broadcast in their own language. So people in East Germany could see that people on the other side of the Berlin Wall were living differently. In 1987, hundreds of teens gathered in Berlin chanting, "The wall must go," because they wanted to go to a David Bowie concert. Conservatives over here were screaming about rock and roll. In East Europe, people wanted rock and roll. The government didn't. And then, in May of 1989, they had an election in East Germany. Those of you old enough to remember the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire know what a joke communist elections were. we understood they're just a joke. But we had access to information that Eastern Europeans didn't. And so some of these people in the peace prayers went out to monitor the elections at the polling places. And when they came back and they compared notes and they watched the results on television, they were shocked to discover that the results being reported didn't match what they had seen. They discovered the elections were a fraud. We always knew that. It was the first time they realized it, apparently. So this created some more agitation. But a month later, the Chinese crackdown in Tiananmen Square reminded people of what happens if you push a communist government. They began worrying. Pardon me? Okay. Okay. I'm not used to speaking without a microphone. There was no precedent for a peaceful transfer of power in a communist country. The minister of the Nikolai Kirka said it wasn't imaginable that the German Democratic Republic would end. So people are worried about what's going on. But Gorbachev again was sending signals that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene in the domestic policies of its client states. That suggested that there wouldn't be a Soviet invasion, but maybe it's okay to keep on talking about these things. And then that summer, Hungary, also behind the Iron Curtain, relaxed its border with Austria. And some Germans discovered you could drive on the one side of the Iron Curtain to Hungary and then drive across the border to Austria. This was not something they had had a chance to do ever since the Berlin Wall went up. Other Germans went to Prague in Czechoslovakia and climbed over the wall of the West German embassy. And under international law, if you're in an embassy, you are in that country. So they were no longer in Czechoslovakia, they were in West Germany, even though they were surrounded by Czechoslovakia, which created a sort of constitutional crisis. What do we do with these people? After the summer, in early September, not 10, not 100, but thousands of people showed up at the St. Nicholas Church for the peace prayers on Monday evening. In front of Western TV cameras that were in Leipzig for a trade show, they unfurled a banner demanding freedom of travel. And the secret police tore it down and tackled the kids, and millions of people saw this on West German television. So a week later, the crowd at the St. Nicholas Church doubled. Now, I went to that church. You could get 100, maybe 200 people in that church. So if thousands of people are going to it, they're out in the streets and squares beyond the church. And in response to the people leaving in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, these people chanted, "Wir bleiben hier," meaning we're staying here. We are not fleeing, we are not leaving, we are staying here in our country and fighting. Monday demonstrations were held at Lutheran churches across East Germany. The next Monday night in Leipzig, 15,000 people marched. The West still isn't paying much attention to this, but it's unprecedented in Eastern Europe. The first Monday in October, the police prepared to deal with 20,000 protesters in Leipzig, but as the service ended, 70,000 people of Leipzig joined them. And the minister of the church recalled later 70,000 people who didn't know if they could come home intact or see their families again. It was a heroic act of moral courage. And slowly the crowd began walking around Leipzig's Ring Road. It's a sort of ring around the city, reasonably close in. You could march around the whole city. And the police, seeing 70,000 people marching with some sort of dissident opinion, waited for orders to tell them what to do about these 70,000 people. And the orders never came. So the police backed off. They didn't have any orders. And that was the end of the communist regime in East Germany. But nobody knew it yet. It still had a few more weeks to go. The next week, on October 16th, it was 150,000 people. The week after, it was 300,000 as people from all over East Germany joined the peaceful march in Leipzig. And again, I want to remind you of what it was like. This never happened in the communist empire. And that night, the party leadership fell. Not the party, not the Communist Party ruled, but the leadership of the Communist Party fell at that point. And on Saturday, November 4th, more than 500,000 people marched in East Berlin, every one of them still not sure what might happen. And 5 days later, the Berlin Wall, the wall that was built to keep people in, the wall that was a permanent part of my childhood and my young adulthood, suddenly opened. It was just open. And people were allowed to travel. They were allowed to leave. And that was the end of the regime. Millions of people suddenly free today. And several years later, I got to talk to a man who had been involved in that effort and who had later become mayor of Leipzig. And I asked him what was it like. And he said, from September 1989, and I hope you know what the Bible tells us, we walked 7 times around the inner city, and then the wall came down. 7 times from September to November 1989. And the minister of a church in East Berlin who was involved in this protest looks back on the events and says no outside force could have done this. That would have meant war. What happened was a self-liberation. Soft water breaks the hardest stone. This is a reminder to us that no army, no state, no government program is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. As I said earlier, we have it much easier than that. We don't have to risk our lives challenging a totalitarian state. But we do know that freedom isn't free. I want to conclude with this thought. I was asked once by some skeptics, what's the most important libertarian accomplishment ever? I thought for a minute. I said the abolition of slavery. They said, okay, name another. I thought the abolition of slavery was pretty good. I thought that if you had the abolition of slavery on your resume, you were prepared to meet your maker. But they said, name another. So I thought a little more carefully, and I said, bringing power under the rule of law. That is a fundamental revolutionary achievement of liberalism, libertarianism, whatever you call the idea of liberty. But it's still incomplete. It's what the Levelers and John Locke and the American founders fought for. It's what people in East Germany in 1989 and people today in China and Iran and Egypt fight for. It's what Rand Paul filibustered for. It's what we fight for. It's why we're here. So thank you all for being part of that struggle.
Did the East Germans get to see David Bowie or not?
Not that time. I assume they did eventually. I don't know what the schedule is, but if there's time for questions, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the new president of Cato?
Sure. To go from the world historical, sure. Cato's founder, Ed Crane, was president of Cato for about 30 years, built the organization that we see. There was a political fight a couple of years ago that resulted in his resignation. A sort of white knight came in, was president for a couple of years, John Allison. He had been at BB&T Bank, but he had already retired once, and he never intended to stay going to an office for long. So about a year ago now, Peter Gettler joined Cato as president. He had a Wall Street career. He retired early, He became a member of Cato's board. He was a member of the Atlas Foundation's board. He traveled a lot to other countries with the Atlas Foundation, the Atlas Network, met a lot of people running think tanks there. I'm not sure how much he learned talking to people who run think tanks in Kazakhstan and Egypt that is relevant to running one in the United States, but he certainly demonstrated his commitment to running a good think tank. So I think that Cato is in good shape now, financially, in terms of our policy output, respect in Washington, and Peter's doing well. I think he'll be there for a while.
Will there be any change in your estimation as to the Cato policies toward foreign policy as it relates to these changes?
No. I mean, I hope there will be changes that will make us better and more effective. And if I knew what we should do in that regard, we would have already done this. So maybe he'll have some ideas. But no, philosophically, ideologically, we're not going to change. Cato's policy, Cato is committed to individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace, and that's not going to change.
What was I asked you earlier what your biggest policy success moment was, and you mentioned the Social Security thing. What was the time when Cato was kind of most out there and alone and catching the most flack for having taken a position?
For taking that position?
Or a position, any position.
Well, the Social Security issue is an interesting one, because there are a lot of people in Washington, who want to be able to say, this is what we did, this is what we influenced, what changed. Donors ask that. What impact do you actually have? I have a 10-page memo on what Cato's impact has been. Social Security is a good example of the way we have chosen to deal with issues. It's a big thing. It is the linchpin of the welfare state. We didn't take on something little. We didn't just take on, I remember a few years ago, one organization was very proud of having stopped the government from imposing a BTU tax. That's good, but number one, it didn't exist. It's always easier to stop it before it starts. And number two, it would have been a small thing anyway. We took on Social Security. We also take on global interventionism. We take on government education. So Social Security, we published a book. I have this wonderful picture. We published a book in 1980, and we took the very young author up to Capitol Hill to speak about it in the heart of the state. And there's this picture. It's like an old Kodak snapshot from 1980, and it shows, a group like this, and right there in the front row, there's an old man. No offense, but this guy was really old. That guy was Congressman Claude Pepper, who had been elected during FDR's term as Senator Claude Pepper. He later lost his Senate seat and came back as a Gray Panther, the avatar of Social Security. So he's like 85 in this picture. And I wondered what he was thinking. I hope he was thinking, everything I have devoted my life to is crumbled. Unfortunately, we haven't yet made major changes in the Social Security system. But one of the things this demonstrates is a commitment, number one, to take on big projects, and number two, to keep at it. So we published a book, and then we took the author to Capitol Hill, and then we held a conference, and then we put the papers from the conference in another book, and then the author wrote a shorter version of his book with more up-to-date numbers, and then we held more conferences. We held an international conference in London about the crumbling Social Security systems around. We discovered that a guy named Jose Piñera had actually implemented something like our plan in Chile right about the same time that we wrote the book, neither knowing of the other's work. So we brought Jose up to the United States to lecture around the country and talk about how to change it. The author of our book got hired by the Reagan administration to be a White House policy advisor, which resulted in a banner headline in the Washington Post saying, "White House rejects advisor's idea to change Social Security." So that's a start. We kept at it. 20 years later, well, let's say 15 years later, Jose Piñera and Ed Crane had lunch, dinner, with the governor of Texas, whose name was George W. Bush. And I'm told that Bush said, Jose, this is a great idea, it's just too bad that it's politically impossible to talk about it. And the people from Cato suggested to him that there wasn't much point in being in politics if you didn't say what you believe. I assume he got a hearty laugh. But he actually did talk about it in his 2000 campaign. Not a lot, but he mentioned it. And then, in 2005, after he was reelected, he said, I've gained political capital and I'm going to use it to change Social Security, create private accounts. The catch-22 at that point was, after 25 years, our idea had made the agenda of the President of the United States of America, and everyone hated him. Even though they had just reelected him, if he had run unopposed, he would have lost. We were doing polling. It turned out, if you went out and said, there's this idea, give people private accounts, allow them to inherit them, leave them to their kids, instead of just paying into Social Security, what do you think of that idea? It's like 60% like it. Then you ask the other half of the panel, President Bush has an idea to change Social Security. Now 40% like it. So we didn't get that implemented, but that was one of the things that we talked about. I do think one thing that happened from that was our idea was to create basically super IRAs. You can put all your Social Security taxes into an IRA instead, which means you own it, you control it, and if you die with money in the account, you can leave it to your heirs instead of just the money goes up in smoke. A spin-off idea from that was health savings accounts. You put money in a health savings account, it's not taxable, you spend it on your own health care. That actually did get implemented by Congress, I guess during the Bush years. Unfortunately, Obamacare essentially killed that option. But for a few years, American business could have taken advantage of health savings accounts and actually changed American medical care. And really, it's a failing of the business community not to have done that. Well, if there are no more questions, all right.
I got one for you, David. We've been following around the Dem debate, and I hear Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton arguing a lot about money in politics and the impact of Citizens United, PACs, dark money, anonymous money. What's your take on that, on Citizens United and the impact it has on our elective cycles?
You know the Bernie Sanders drinking game? You watch the debate, and every time he says something will be free, you drink somebody else's beer. I am a First Amendment absolutist. I believe everybody has a right to speak. I believe sexist college students and racist Trump supporters, or racist anybody, and communists, and everybody has a right to speak. That includes people who want to speak by giving money to someone who is more articulate. If you are the owner of the Washington Post, do you think you can influence an election? Of course. You can endorse, you can put candidates on the front page, whatever. If you're the owner of Walmart, your endorsement isn't going to matter very much. You don't have a front page, but you could give money to a candidate you like. I think that's one way of balancing those scales. So, Citizens United was correctly decided because there is a First Amendment. And spending money to advance your ideas is part of the First Amendment. And the reason there's so much money in politics is there's so much politics in our money. If government wasn't so big, people wouldn't care as much who's running it. So, the interesting question for an economist is why is there so little money in politics? You hear these stories. We're going to spend $4 billion on the election this year. You know what else we spend $4 billion on this year? Corn chips. Halloween candy. Do you think the election of the president and Congress is at least as important as Halloween candy? The interesting question is why we don't see a whole lot more spent, and also on lobbying. There are many different figures for how much money is spent on lobbying. Maybe it's $4 billion a year, maybe it's $2 billion a year. It's a $4 trillion pool of money. Why are they only spending that much? And there's a lot of explanations. You know, much of what is spent is entitlements, payments, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. It's hard really for you to get a piece of that, even if you hired a lobbyist. A On the other hand, if you're a doctor, a physician's assistant, an alternative health care provider, a drug company, a hospital, a state hospital system, all of those people have lobbyists, and each and every one of them has a named provision in Obamacare that spells out the graft that they will be able to get from the system. So, as long as government has favors to hand out, people are going to find a way to try to get it. And it seems to me we might as well have the money as above board as it can be. And
So do you agree with disclosure then?
that's an interesting question. I certainly think disclosure is better than restrictions. But here's the problem with disclosure. Disclosure is great if you're a politically active person, let's say like Charles Koch, like George Soros. You don't mind people knowing that you're spending money on politics. But suppose you're not that politically active and you want to support an unpopular idea. Then disclosure becomes a problem, and the Supreme Court has recognized this in the past. I believe it was the Wisconsin Socialist Workers' Party that petitioned not to have to disclose the names of its contributors because people might react badly to discovering that their tenant or their co-worker was giving money to the Socialist Workers' Party. And so they got, I'm not actually sure of the law, but they got some sort of exemption. It was also a case involving the NAACP.
No.
How would you like to be an Alabama businessman discovered to have given money to the NAACP in 1955? So they also was agreed they could keep their books secret. I have friends who worked for term limits about 20 years ago, and they said they had a lot of people say to them, listen, I agree with you, but I can't be on any list of people supporting term limits. It's the governor, the senator. They wouldn't like that. I looked all over. Back in 1978, as I mentioned earlier today, I worked for Ed Clark's campaign for governor in California. There's probably no one here who knows what was going on politically in California in 1978.
Tax revolt.
That's one. It's two big things. Two big things from our point of view. One was Proposition 13, the tax cut. The other was one of the very first statewide anti-gay initiatives. This one specifically was to say gay people couldn't teach in public schools. And I read in the Los Angeles Times that year, the guy who was leading the opposition to the anti-gay initiative said, we get a lot of $49 contributions. Why are they getting a lot of $49 contributions? Because if it's $50, you have to report it to the government. And so he will give them $49. Makes it tough to raise money. Now the interesting thing is, so disclosure was hurting the effect of gay people and their friends to resist political oppression. That was what, 1978. 30 years later, Proposition 8 to overturn gay marriage in California, the numbers have gone up. It's $100 now instead of $50. But what happened there? And now, because of computers, it's much easier to find out. There were people who used their software skills to take all the Secretary of State's information on who was giving money on either side of Prop 8 and put it into a user-friendly website. So you could go look up, did any of your neighbors or co-workers give? And some conservatives jumped on this and said, this businessman who gave money to oppose Prop 8, we're going to launch a boycott of it. Didn't work. In fact, there was blowback. People didn't like that. And then what happened was the pro-gay marriage side decided to try boycotting people who were giving money to support Prop 8, and they found a much friendlier reception. The zeitgeist had changed overnight, and the conservatives didn't realize it, and it turned out to be conservative supporters of Prop 8 who became embarrassed. I know that one of the things that happened because this was so easy to do, you had people saying on Facebook, I am wondering why my friends, X, Y, and Z, are not recorded as having given money to stop Prop 8. Well, that's an interesting kind of public social pressure. I'm not sure if that's a good thing. So I have real doubts about disclosure. I would definitely trade disclosure for getting rid of the regulations. Citizens United only applies to one narrow thing. It doesn't lift the lid on what you can give to candidates. And one thing, if you don't like people giving all this money to super PACs, change the rules so they can give it directly to the candidate. Anyway, First Amendment view.
Yes.
Yes.
Could you tell us your handicap on Hillary Clinton getting indicted before the end of the year?
It's very hard to imagine that the Obama Justice Department is going to indict Hillary Clinton.
Can't Congress do anything?
Congress can't indict people because we have separation of powers, which is a good thing. Congress could hold hearings, which they're doing. They're holding Benghazi hearings, and I guess they've also held some hearings on the emails. One of the problems is anything Congress passes, the president has a chance to veto. So that's why there's such gridlock out there. Things Congress would pass, the president would veto, and so people don't see the point in even passing it. So it's very difficult. I don't know that what she did is actually illegal. It was unwise, it was imprudent, but there was apparently, as Al Gore famously said, no controlling legal authority that required her to use the State Department's email system. It was highly recommended at the time. And it does appear that she's used her private email more than any of her predecessors, for whom email was a new thing. We're evolving standards about email. So I think it's very unlikely. I know there are people who are saying, Obama hates her, and he's just waiting and they're going to send him. But, you know, if he hated her, it seems to me he would have been grooming another candidate. If he sandbags her now, what do the Democrats do? Nominate Bernie Sanders? Are you kidding? Nominate Joe Biden, who's a buffoon anyway, and who already made a big show of announcing he wasn't going to run, and who's 73 years old. I don't think the Obama people, in fact, have it in for her, and I can't imagine her getting it. But I couldn't imagine Donald Trump being running for president either, so listen to what I say. I'll take questions from people who haven't already asked one, but there don't seem to be any. So, Andy?
Yes. Well, I was just going to say, you talked about the early days of the party when you were involved in the Ed Clark campaigns. One of my goals for the party has been that we can be a hub for the broader movement like we were then. Do you think that's ever going, do you think there's any hope for the party to serve that kind of function? That we can be the on-the-ground here out in the 50 states where there isn't a Cato here in Wisconsin? What do you think?
One of the reasons the Libertarian Party is perhaps less a hub to the broader movement than it was then is that the movement is broader. So it's harder to be the center of it because there are so many more aspects. Politics was different then. We thought we were going to build a new party like the Republicans in the 1850s. I hope Ed Clark won't mind my mentioning after 37 years what he told me the weekend before the election in 1978, which was, David, in elections where there's no Libertarian on the ballot, vote Republican, because we don't want the Republican Party to die before we're ready to take its place. This is 2 years before Ronald Reagan was elected. Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So what you had at that time was a movement that was basically Cato and Reason and some other Cato-affiliated groups, and a Libertarian Party that people did hope would become a major party, and all these other groups would, in a sense, orbit around it, the way the Heritage Foundation orbits around the Republican Party. The movement got bigger, at least the libertarian-ish movement, or maybe even just the free market movement. The Libertarian Party didn't get bigger, really. So I guess the answer is, if the Libertarian Party became a lot bigger, then yes, there would be a movement oriented around it. But the challenge is to make the Libertarian Party big enough. And the other thing is, people who feel strongly about political ideas often feel strongly about electing people who share those ideas or come closer than other people do. And so, you know, I've got colleagues who are supporting Ted Cruz. I certainly had colleagues who were supporting Rand Paul. I've even got one colleague who went door to door today for John Kasich. Because in his perception, well, you don't want Bernie and Hillary, you sure as hell don't want Donald Trump, and you don't want Ted Cruz either. And that leaves Kasich as the last non-insane potential president. Whether or not you agree with that, it's a lot of people who are interested in their ideas want to see their ideas actually elected. Me, I don't care that much. I figure I'm never responsible because my candidates never win. But that's a challenge for a third party. I mean, you don't see the important socialists and social democrats rallying around the Socialist Workers' Party or even the Green Party. Sometimes they drift in and out, like Ralph Nader did, like Bernie Sanders. You know, Bernie Sanders was never a Democrat until this year. But mostly, if you're basically a socialist, which, let's face it, a lot of Democrats are, then you're going to orbit around the Democratic Party. And the Libertarian Party hasn't made itself an organization that would generate that kind of activity. Okay, I sense that that's all. Okay, there's one. Now you need to speak up.
I've never heard that before. Do you have any suggestions on how to grow the party?
Well, I think it's tough because we do have this first past the post system. People always think if I vote for this candidate who isn't likely to win, I'm throwing my vote away. Now, there are responses to that, like you are more likely to be killed in an accident on the way to the polls than to influence the outcome of the presidential election. So why don't you just vote for what you believe in? Eugene Debs, who ran many times as a socialist, used to say it's better to vote for what you want and not get it than to vote for what you don't want and get it. And I tend to agree with that. But a lot of people don't. And I will tell you, I think if it's Trump versus Hillary, or especially Trump versus Sanders, which I don't think could happen, ought to be the biggest opening for an intelligent, accomplished third-party candidate ever, because who would want either one of those people to be president? I thought, by the way, that that would also be true of Bush and Clinton. I mean, really, vote for the president's brother or the president's wife or a person of accomplishment who doesn't come from the political establishment. But we didn't get Bush, and we're probably still going to get Clinton. The problem, and I can see this in talking to friends of mine, is that so many people are going to end up saying, yes, I know they're both terrible, but she's really terrible, or, but he's really terrible. I mean, I know libertarians who are saying they will vote for Hillary Clinton to keep Trump out of the White House. I was just showing Andy a tweet that I just saw today by a leading conservative, quoting another leading conservative and saying, I agree with Jonah Goldberg, never Trump, never Bernie or Hillary, which means intelligent conservatives are saying in writing that they will never vote for the candidates likely to be nominated this year. So that is an opening for somebody. Now, some of those conservatives are talking about finding a conservative third party to run, but you all know how difficult it would be to start a third party campaign on April 20th. So I don't think they will do that. And that will leave them with the challenge of Trump, Hillary, or the Green or Libertarian Party candidates. And that ought to be an opening. But I think a lot of them, when it comes down to it, will decide they have to keep Hillary out of the White House. And a smaller number will decide they have to keep Trump out of the White House. Now, all of that is assuming Trump gets nominated. If Cruz gets nominated, all the conservatives are happy enough. They're all going to vote for Cruz. You have to find the libertarian independents and so on. But the question was, what can the Libertarian Party do? So you have the problem with this first-past-the-post system. It makes it very difficult. And, as you know, they put all these special obstacles in the way, like the campaign finance, and the ballot access rules, and the debate rules, and all of those things. That makes it difficult. My understanding, my impression is that Libertarian candidates are much more likely to get to debate in a Senate or gubernatorial race than they are in a presidential race, considering that the latter is 0. It would only take one to make the other more likely. But I sense that happens a lot, so that's a challenge. I told people earlier today, you got to get good at politics if you want to have a political party that's successful. You have to get more people here. You have to get more people to come to rallies. How many people have invited someone to come to an event for one of your presidential candidates? Someone who wasn't already in the Libertarian Party. Okay, I didn't quite make that a real question. Nobody's jumping to say yes. That's what you have to do. Some of you may know who Marshall Fritz was. He created the Advocates for Self-Government. And he had this idea that was mathematically perfect. Everyone invites 6 friends to come to a libertarian learning session for 6 weeks or something. And then each one of those 6 invites 6 more people, and 6 more people, and he proved that in 18 months we would have 100 million libertarians. But it foundered on the problem that most libertarians don't have 6 friends. So, you got to go out and get 6 friends.
Not 6 friends anymore.
And then you got to get 3 of them to come to a Libertarian Party speech or something like that, or to come over and watch a speech on television. And that's what I think we've never managed to get people to. I'll tell you one story from my days back in the Libertarian Party. Well, it's a multi-part story. We often had the sense, those of us in what used to be known as the nefarious train machine, used to have the sense that libertarians didn't take their own candidates as seriously as they wanted the rest of the world to take. I can remember when I was running the Clark for Governor campaign in 1978. Technically, I was the co-manager. You want to know a prescription for disaster in any entity? Having 2 CEOs. It worked for us in the Clark for Governor campaign for 2 reasons. Number one, Ed Crane, although not officially on the campaign staff, was really the campaign guru who told us once a day what we ought to be doing. And number 2, because the other co-manager and I had exactly complementary skills. He was close to illiterate, and I had no people skills at all. So I wrote, and he talked. And it worked. But one of the things we noticed was we had to rely entirely on volunteers. And so we would be saying to people in a local party, we're going to send Ed Clark to San Bernardino next Thursday. Would you please organize a day for him in San Bernardino? And we would call back on Tuesday and say, what have you got for him? Well, I thought we'd have him walk over to campus and, shake some hands on campus. And we were going to call the local newspaper and see if they would do something. So they didn't take him seriously as a gubernatorial candidate. Why should the local party? And then a friend of mine at the 1979 convention was elected to the Libertarian National Committee. It was her first time in fact, I'm not going to give her name because she might not want it known, but she was the committee man from Wisconsin. And so this was her first experience in national politics, and she went to the meeting of the LNC that concluded the National Convention in 1979. And she said, so I'm sitting there, this young person from Wisconsin, first time on the National Committee, and we're doing our business, and we're talking about raising money. Suddenly, the doors open, and this group of people sweeps in with Ed Clark at the center, and the chairman turns and says, Ed Clark, our presidential nominee, is here. Ed, would you like to address the LNC? And he came up and he addressed, And when he was finished, he left and took his entourage with him. And she was like, wow, that was it. She said 4 years later, when most of my friends had given up on the LP, she had not sought re-election as an LNC member, but the LNC meetings are open, at least they were then. And so she went and sat in a corner of the room to watch the first LNC meeting of the new LNC. And she said they're doing their business, and David Berglund, the party's nominee, is sitting at the table, because he is actually also a member of the LNC. And so he's sitting there, and they do the minutes, and they do old business, and they do new business. And after a couple of new business items, they say, Dave, is there anything you would like to say? She said, they don't take him seriously. Why do they think anybody else is going to? So, when you've got a candidate, treat him like a serious candidate. At least make people think you think that he's as good as Russ Feingold, or Tammy Baldwin, or Ron Johnson, or Hillary Clinton. And then maybe that attitude will rub off. People will think, oh, wow, we have a libertarian presidential. And then my other tip is find a billionaire to figure out. That's what the campaign finance laws do. And that was one of the things that helped Ed Clark in both his gubernatorial and his presidential race. California had no limits on contributions at that time, or if they had limits, they were high. And Clark was able to get 2 or 3 very large contributions that allowed us to do some serious advertising. And then, of course, in 1980, because there were federal limits that were extremely severe, he was able to talk David Koch into being his running mate, which was the only way David Koch could give more than $1,000 to the Libertarian campaign. And that is something that the Libertarian Party has not managed to pull off again. It's tough. There aren't that many billionaires. I don't know if David Koch even was a billionaire at that time, but he was willing to give $3 or $4 million to the campaign, which was a hell of a lot of money in 1980. The equivalent would probably be 15, 20 million today. And if you compared it to what the other candidates are spending, you would need even more than that. So those are a few thoughts. It is a tough road to hoe. Yes?
Can you speak to candidates running for local office, even though they might be nonpartisan?
Well, I'm all in favor of people running for office, and if you can win a local nonpartisan office, I think that's good. And I guess
I won too. I was an alderman and a school board member.
All right, good. What I would say generally is probably helpful there is actually being a respected member of the community. And I do think that's a problem sometimes for libertarians, that they just maybe haven't been as community-oriented as the candidates who typically get elected. I have a friend who ran for Congress as a Republican in Washington. I think he was challenging an incumbent. That's very difficult. He was a smart guy, but he showed me his website. And his website is full of things like he's an international economics consultant, and he's written papers on international economics for the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute. And I said, get that off there. Nobody's going to vote for you because you've written papers for the Cato Institute. Do you own a home in your district? If so, say so. It sounds stupid. Say you're a homeowner. Do you go to church? If so, say so. Do you have children? Are you married? Put a picture of your family on there. He was a sort of typical INTJ libertarian intellectual. And I don't think he did go to church. And he may not have owned his home. He probably wasn't a veteran. When I was a little boy, and World War II wasn't that far away, even though I thought it was ancient history, I realize now, gosh, that was only like 20 years after World War II. All the candidates in my county had little cards, and they always said veteran. And I asked my mother, why does everybody say veteran on their cards? And she said, well, you wonder what was wrong with the man who wasn't a veteran. Now, you might not wonder that today because we have many fewer veterans, but I understand why men in their 40s in the 1960s, if they had not been in World War II, must have been something wrong with them. So everybody said, those kinds of things, I would think, are the fact that you're active in the PTA and the Kiwanis are more likely to help you in a local race than the fact that you've read the Cato Handbook for Policymakers, although you should. So those would be my suggestions. Have friends and get them involved in your campaign. I'm not absolutely sure how much that grows the Libertarian Party, because if it's nonpartisan, then the name isn't getting out there as much. On the other hand, if you're elected to a nonpartisan school board or water board, you are in better position then to run for the city council or the state legislature. One of the things Ed Clark encountered when he was running for governor was people like newspaper editorial boards saying, why don't you run for Congress? We would endorse you for Congress. We can't endorse you for governor. So it might always be, you know, there are candidates who would do better at a lower level, but everybody would like to run for something bigger. Okay, now I think everybody's talked out. Thank you all. Thank you, Gary, for being
If I may add just one thing to what David was saying, and it's something that I've observed in my last 4.5 years of doing this radio product, is the messaging is super important. Talking about libertarian ideas, talking about liberty over and over and over again. On a show like mine, how many of you heard the Devil's Advocates before you came here today? A few. I'm like the only libertarian around. Now take away those that have been on the show, and it's maybe a whole lot less. Certainly not a paid and bought for product, but friendly voices are always. You talk about having friends, David. Utilize your friends. Get involved, contact with your local papers. Write opinion pieces. Talk to your journalist. I mean, Christian Snyder writes for the Journal Sentinel. He's a pretty right-leaning guy. We talk about radio in the Milwaukee market. Lots of conservative talk radio. They're utilizing the politics, the parties, certainly not the Dems in that case, but the Republicans in my area utilize the media and their relationships to a fine degree. And that's something I think when we're coming out from we're still the third largest party in the country, but we're not as fine-tuned on the messaging and who our friends are and how we can get our messages out. And I think working with some of that, I'm certainly happy to do that. I think it's been helpful a little bit with Phil and with Andy coming on. So utilize those resources if you can do so. Folks, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. The 2016 Libertarian Party Wisconsin Convention. Thank you so much. Recognizing Devin. Is still here, Devin? Devin is not here, of course. David, thank you so much once again. My notorious progressive co-host Crudy for introducing me. And certainly I want to talk, and if you would please, the candidates that are running on the Libertarian ticket this year. Matthew Bugman. Matt, you still here? Matt, stand up, will you please, everybody. Jason, Jason, there he is. George, there. Thank you, George. Stand up. Keep standing up. Keep standing up. Jason Levi. Where's Jason? Jason, stand up. Keep standing up. Out there. Now, if anybody else running, for the folks, we need to support. We need to step it up and do a good work. We got to go out there and support them. And now, thank you so much for having me. Every day.
And big round of applause for Nathan, our convention chair.
After Dominic.
And one more time.